Good afternoon again, everyone. This is the fifth of our six-part series of Women Adventurers, and we're just delighted to have you here in the Oak Room and those of you who are joining us on Zoom. And I'm so pleased that we have Dr. Lee Ren Kaplan, who is going to speak on the olive tree in our dreams, San Mao and the liberation of female imagination in mainland China. Based on research and the speaker's personal experience growing up in mainland China in the 1980s, when Taiwanese writer and traveler San Mao's books were introduced to a larger group of readers, mostly women, this lecture focuses on San Mao's influence on a generation of young people at a time of tremendous social, cultural, and economic changes. Dr. Lee Ren Kaplan grew up in Sichuan, China, the home of spicy food and panda bears. After finishing her bachelor's degree in English language and literature at Peking University, she came to the United States 26 years ago and received her master's and PhD in communication studies from Ohio University. She specializes in intercultural communication and communication for social change. Her dissertation, Imagining China in the Era of Global Consumerism and Local Consciousness, Media, Mobility, and the Spring Festival, investigated globalization, nationalization, and societal cultural transformation in contemporary China. Dr. Ren Kaplan has been a professor of speech communication at Santa Fe College since 2007, and we're so pleased to have her this afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Kaplan.
Ready? Okay, thank you so much for having me. So to start, I want to get you guys on a time machine. I want you to travel back to the 80s and also to a different place. So this will be a very small town in Sichuan, China. It's like an inland city. Sorry. It's an inland city in China, and I was a young teenager, middle schooler, and one day I went to the local bookstore and I discovered this one book. And I literally, just like any teenager, I didn't have much money, so I stood there for the whole day. I finished the book right there because I didn't have money to buy it. But this book was written by San Mao. So when I was asked to give a lecture about San Mao, I was very excited because this was one book really changed me in many ways. And it was really a pleasure to do the research and get this lecture together. So fast forward to 2019, I was just like anybody. I was already in Gainesville. I was doing Google search and I opened the Google page and I see this very familiar image. I was like, wow, that looks like San Mao. And then I looked and it was San Mao because this was March 26, 2019. It was San Mao's 76th birthday. And apparently, she also got some fans in Google, which was very surprising. But anyway, so today my lecture titled as The Olive Tree in Our Dreams. And the song you just heard, it was titled The Olive Tree. The lyrics was written by, they were written by San Mao. And so she was talking about this longing for this faraway place and looking for this ideal. It's almost like a homeland for her. And I know the title says San Mao and the liberation of female imagination in China. I'm not saying San Mao actually, she was responsible for the liberation of female imagination in mainland China. But what I'm trying to say is her work came at a perfect historic moment in mainland China that really helped young women like me at that time being able to imagine some other places, some other life, and that was actually possible. So today I'm going to first talk about San Mao's life and her work. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how her life intersects with the modern Chinese history. Then I'm going to talk about the Chinese women status in the past 100 years, and then also how she had impact a whole generation of young women. So let's start with Shan Mao. So Shan Mao was born back in 1943, and she died pretty young, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And her original name was Chen Maoping, and she was a very kind of rebellious kind of spirit. Even when she was young, she really did not like the middle character of her name because it was really hard to write. You have to admit that. So she herself changed her name to Chen Ping instead of Chen Maoping. So she took the middle character out. And then eventually, once she started to write, and she took the pen name as San Mao, which literally means 3 hair, all 30 cents. In Chinese, it has a dual meaning. And the name originally came from a comic character created back in 1930s. And he was like a homeless boy in the street of Shanghai. And so San Mao, the name literally means he has 3 hair in his head, but also he was living in poverty. That's why the name San Mao. And it was a very well-known name in China to start with. And then Shan Mao, the writer, when she wanted to have a pen name, and she wanted to have the name Shan Mao because she had a lot of self-confidence, like self-esteem issues. She felt like she's only worth 30 cents. And she also liked the name because it's so simple to write. Shan Mao at the very beginning, and she was born actually in Chongqing, which is a city, inland city in mainland China. And then when she was very, very young, her parents had to move to Taiwan because that was when the nationalist government lost the Civil War, and the whole government, I believe her father worked for the nationalist government, so the whole government had to retreat to Taiwan with a promise they might come back very soon, which never happened. So she actually pretty much grew up in Taiwan. And then when she was very young, she had to drop out middle school. There was an incident where she was not very good with school to start with, and then she was particularly bad with math. And just like, if you have that stereotype of Chinese kids all good with math, she's not very good with math. So she got like a really bad score for one of her math tests. And her math teacher, made her stand in front of the entire class and then draw 2 zeros around her eyes. Basically, she said, you got 0 out of the whole test. And she was so humiliated, she would not go back to school. She just refused to go back to school. So her parents had to homeschool her for the rest of those school years. And eventually she did go to Chinese Culture University in Taipei to try to study philosophy. But then at the age of 20, she decided to go abroad. She went to Germany. She actually briefly was in Illinois, in the United States. And eventually she moved to Madrid. She really liked Madrid a lot. And so that's where she spent quite a few years there. And then Madrid was also the place where she met her husband. So her husband was, I'm going to really mispronounce the name, Jose Maria Quiro y Ruiz. And so they met, and he was a high school kid, and she was a college student. And then she, at that time, she read our National Geographic article about West Sahara. And she was just fascinated by it. For some weird reason, that's a place she wanted to be. So she told Jose, she said, I'm going to move to West Sahara, and that's where I'm going to be. And so she moved there, and then Jose followed her. And he went over there. He found a job. He was an engineer. So he found a job locally in West Sahara. At that time, West Sahara was under Spanish rule. It was so they lived there for a few years. And then they had to evacuate in 1975 because at that time, Spain basically was giving back the control of the area to Morocco. but the local tribes were having a rebellion. So they were fighting the Moroccan government army. And so there was a civil war broken out. And it was a very dangerous situation. So Spanish government evacuated all the Spanish citizens. So they had to leave there, which she was very, very upset about the whole situation. So they moved to the Canary Islands and lived there for a few years until 1979. And that's when Jose died in a diving accident. So he died very young, and she was, of course, heartbroken. So her parents thought it was not very good for her to live on her own. So she moved back to Taiwan after that. And then she started to, at that time, she already started to be well known in Taiwan as a travel writer. So she started to teach at universities, and she also started to do a lot of public lectures. And then publishers started to commission her to go on trips and then write books. So she continued to write and travel. And then after mainland China opened back in the late 80s, she started to visit mainland China. She still had a lot of like extended family members living back in mainland China. So she went many times to visit. But in 1991, she committed suicide. I still remember I was a college student, and we have like a radio station with a lot of loudspeakers in in the on campus. And I remember that morning, and when they announced the news, I remember like the whole campus was quiet. There was like everybody just so shocked because she was so well known in mainland China at that time, particularly around college students, particularly around female college students. So I clearly remember in my dorm, we talk about it for the whole day, and then everybody was talking about that for a while, about her death. It was a very tragic event. So she died actually really relatively young. So she, in terms of her work, she originally started writing when she was living in West Sahara. And she was just like writing about every day, what happened with the neighbor, what happened with Jose's boss, how does she trying to cook Chinese food in the desert, and how was she trying to use Chinese herbal medicine to heal her neighbors. And there are just like a really funny, interesting stories. And so she wrote those little articles, and she will send it back to Taiwan and publish in the local Taiwanese newspaper. And then finally the editor said, well, those stories are so interesting. You should really kind of put them together and just publish a book. And she was a housewife at that time. You know, Jose was working. So she's like, oh, sure, I'll do it. So she so the first book she published is called Stories of the Sahara. That was her most well-known work, body of work. There were like very interesting small stories about everyday life she had living in the desert. And then most her work were really non-fictional. It's about travel, about everyday life. But she did publish one book. It's called The Crying Camel. It was a fictional story about the civil war in West Sahara at that time, and that was like one of the few fictional books she published. And then she did do a couple of books about reflection about her young, like when she was young, like in college and in high school. And that one is connected in the book called Gone with the Rainy Season. And then after she went back to Taiwan after Jose's death, and she was commissioned to travel to Latin America, and one book came out of that. It's called Far Across the World. That was mostly about Latin American countries. And then lastly, she was actually very well known to write the script for screenplay for this movie called Red Dust. It was an extremely successful movie. So in 1990, it came out. And for the 1991, when they had the Taiwanese Oscar, it's called Golden Horse Film Festival. And this movie this film got 9 nominations, including a screenwriting nomination for her. It did win quite a few awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actress, everything except screenwriting. And many people speculate and her suicide might be related to how she felt like that was such a blow to her self-esteem, and eventually she committed suicide. That we never know for sure what was the reason behind her suicide. She didn't leave a note or anything to explain. She was in the hospital for some treatment, but it wasn't like a fatal or anything very serious. But that was one of the speculations. People say why she killed herself. So I do want to kind of give you a clear picture of where her life intersects with Chinese history. I know everybody's life is intersecting with the history we lived through, but the years she was alive, it was really a dramatic changing period of Chinese history. So it's interesting to see how that affects her and particularly her writing. So first of all, she was born during the Sino-Japanese War. Of course, that eventually became part of the larger World War II. And the reason she was born in Chongqing was because her family had to evacuate from the coastal area of China to inland because Japanese occupation. So Chongqing actually was the capital during the wartime for China at that time. And so her, just kind of by the virtue of where she was born, it really reflects that part of the Chinese history. And then, of course, the evacuation was a big thing as well. At that time, after the Sino-Japanese War, after the end of World War II, there was almost immediately there was a civil war between the Communist Party and the nationalist government. Eventually, the nationalists lost, and so that's when they decided, well, we're going to Taiwan, this little island, we're going to recover and come back, right? So a lot of people, like people work for the nationalist government, or people in the nationalist army, they left everything behind. They left their family behind. There are husbands separate from wives. There are children separate from parents, and they all thought they would come back in a couple of years, and then of course never happened. So she, her family, her dad works for the nationalist government. They all moved to Taiwan, and with the government. And then, of course, at that time, the nationalist government establishing Taiwan, they are known as the Republic of China. And then the communist government, which basically are in the mainland part of China, they are the People's Republic of China. And they both claim to be the legitimate government of the entire China. So, it's like it doesn't matter. Like we include Taiwan, and Taiwan say, we have the entire mainland. So just give you some perspective. Of course, that's a tiny little island of Taiwan, and this is the mainland. So again, like she grew up in the era that there was always government, propaganda basically just saying, we're going back to China, we're going back. So there was never a sense of homeland for her in Taiwan because it wasn't. So when she was, so at this time, also remember the international order was also forming after World War II, and ROC, because the nationalist governments, when they were after World War II, they were the legitimate government in China to start with, and they were actually the founding member of the United Nations. So they got a seat. They were like the legitimate government for China, even after they moved to Taiwan. But eventually, the People's Republic of China started to gain more influence, and slowly, and everybody noticed that the ROC was not going to go back to mainland China. So PRC is getting officially more recognized and eventually become part of the United Nations in 1971. And then ROC was forced to just use Taipei. They cannot, like even now with Olympics games, you can see they will hold the sign, it will say Taipei, China. They're not supposed to be recognized as a country internationally. And also a lot of countries started to cut off their diplomatic ties with ROC, because once they established a diplomatic relationship with mainland China, with PRC says you cannot, have the same relationship with another government who came to be the government of the entire China. So they start to cut ties with ROC, and so Spain basically stopped their diplomatic relationship with Taiwan in '73. Remember, this was a year Samuel actually lived in Spain. So it was a very odd situation where she was holding the passport, and the passport actually officially was not recognized by many countries. She can travel, but it's like a really odd situation for Taiwanese residents. And then, of course, the United States established a relationship with China. And then once that, like, pretty much the international community all went to PRC. And Taiwan actually, I think, had about 16 countries still had some kind of diplomatic relationship with them. But most recently, I don't know if you heard the recent news about the tension and all the military drill, but Honduras, it was the latest country just dropped Taiwan. They joined PRC about 3 weeks ago. So there's still this pressure of cutting that off. So the reason I mentioned this is the thing, if you ever read Samuel's work, she has a very good sense of humor, and she, when she talk about everyday incident, events and stories, and it's very fun to read her stories. But underneath, there's always this, there's a facade almost of this being very cheerful and very confident, and she's in control of everything. But underneath, there's always that little sadness. I think it has something to do with her lack of sense of belonging, and she's always had this longing to be somewhere, but she doesn't know where is her place kind of situation. And this also contributes to her eagerness to go back to China. So once mainland China opened up to Taiwanese residents to travel, she went back so many times, and she was very, very excited. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but I think it has something to do with her the entire longing to belong to a place. Okay, so now I'm going to switch to talking about women's status in China. So we will start from the very beginning, but mostly focus on the past 400 years. So of course, the traditional Chinese society was not very friendly to women, and physically we were restrained, right? Of course, you have the foot binding tradition. My grandma was born in 1910, somewhere there. I forgot, sorry. So she actually was the last generation actually still were, in some parts of China, they were still practicing foot binding. And she refused. She actually, during the day, her parents would kind of wrap it up, and then at night she would just cut them off. And so eventually her parents gave up because she was the only daughter. They were kind of spoiling her in a way. But I grew up with my grandparents, so I met some of their friends. So their generation, their women still had feet like that, and they couldn't stand, because I remember a neighbor, and she would be waving the entire time we talked. She couldn't stand for too long. So with that kind of physical damage to your body, you really physically cannot go anywhere. So that's the first thing. But also there are a lot of social, cultural restraints as well. So for example, there is this thing called 3 obediences. Basically, it sounds ridiculous. So basically, as a woman, you have to obey. This is without this unconditional obedience, right? You obey your father before you get married. Then you obey your husband when you get married. And then you obey your oldest son if your husband died. I was like, what if your oldest son is 2? Are you still going to obey your oldest son? But basically, as a woman, you don't have any way to have control. And then the four virtues, I actually need to read that because I don't know. That's a good thing. So the four virtues for women is morality, proper speech, modest manners, and diligent work. So basically, those are like you have to possess those four virtues to be worthy. And when they say worthy, it's worthy to be married to anybody. Then, of course, women mostly couldn't, in history, couldn't inherit anything, couldn't own property. And then women generally cannot go get an education. So there are some educated women, mostly they have homeschool, they have tutors and things like that. But other than that, my grandma was illiterate. And then she only got to some education after communists took over. She went to a night school and learned how to write and how to read. So it's a very limited society. And also it's not just for like upper class women, like the food bindings thing, right? It's like, hey, if you don't have to work, then the foot binding seem to be like, at least you don't have to kind of be on your feet all the time. But also working class women, it's the same thing. And basically, my grandma told me, her mom basically told her that you were not marriable. Nobody would marry you. You're not marriage material if you don't have smaller feet. So that was a very different time. It didn't change until about 100, 150 years ago. So the change really happened around the time when Western powers forced open Chinese borders. And it's unfortunate because it was a really turbulent part of the Chinese history. But after the Opium War, back in the 1840s and 50s, 60s, and China had to open up the country for trade, and also kind of, of course, Hong Kong was leased to Britain, and then there are other parts of China where also become concessions. So China finally realized we are not very strong economically, we're not strong militarily, so as a country, we're not very powerful. So a lot of reformers around that time, this is like the last dynasty in China. So a lot of reformers at that time say, well, we want to be stronger, but how can we be stronger? We cannot leave out half of the population. We have to say women need to be educated, they need to be participant of the society for us to get stronger. So they start to advocate for women's rights and being participant full participant of the society. And then Xinhai Revolution happened in 1911. This was basically overthrew the last emperor of China. This was Qing dynasty, and then eventually they established the Republic of China, which is a more democratic kind of society. And then that one foundation they were talking about is really equality of the gender. And very interestingly, during that time, I didn't know about this. There were actually women in the army who were participating in the revolution. They were actually fighting in the front. And then, so around this time, basically, they already start to set up schools. And for women, these women were participating in schools. They become a little bit, having a little bit more freedom. And then also culturally, there was this new culture movement that they have this concept called new women. So you can see women now here, they're going to school. They don't have, they are having what we call natural feet, big feet. And so they're getting jobs, particularly in urban area, you definitely see that transformation. But nothing is so dramatic as the after Communist Party took over mainland China. So after the Civil War, when the Communist Party won the war and they established People's Republic of China, and the role of women in the society was very dramatically changed. So basically, they are supposed to be full participants of the society. They are like doing all kinds of jobs. And so those are all posters from that era where women were doing all kinds of work. There was no such thing as this line of work is women's work, this line of work is men's work. It's a very, like the image is, images of women were very dramatically different. of course, the communist ideology, just ideally, it's really advocating gender equality. But also Mao himself, the first leader, paramount leader of China, himself actually, despite all the terrible things he did, he was a feminist, considered by a lot of people as a feminist. It was very interesting because his second wife, who died very, very young and supposed to be the love of his life, was one of the first feminists in China. And her dad set up many schools for girls back in the 20s and 30s. So he does have that mentality about women should be equal in the society. And also at that time, what they were trying to do is not just say, hey, we're just saying women are equal and stuff, and we're going to codify it, we're going to put it in the law, right? So this was actually a draft of the PRC constitution. So in there, basically it says they're trying to say, we are going to guarantee the equal rights of women in this new republic of ours. So they actually wrote it in their economic, cultural, educational, and social life, and freedom of marriage. So it's very interesting. Actually, one of the first laws passed under the communist in PRC under the communist government was the marriage law. So marriage law was passed in 1950. Traditionally, Chinese marriage, women had no say. The marriage mostly arranged, and also women, once you're married, women cannot ask for a divorce. Only men can ask for divorce. But if you were ever asked to be divorced as a woman, you will live in disgrace forever. And then also men were allowed to have multiple wives. They have concubines. So those are very traditional kind of marriage structure of Chinese society at that time. And before this, there were attempts during the nationalist government to modernize family structure. They were trying to promote more modern structure, like monogamy, and also freedom of choice and kind of marriage. But they were never put in law, and also the influence of that never went beyond the more elite sector of the society. So it's more urban area, more educated people. They're more okay, marriage is more freedom of choice. But this new marriage law was everybody. And you have to admire the Communist Party government's efficiency, because in about this was so this law was passed in 1950. By 1955, over 90% of the marriages in China were fit into this new modernist kind of model of marriage and family. So basically, it's basically about individualism, monogamy, and freedom of choice, right? So basically, all the marriages were registered. Doesn't matter if it's urban area, rural area, all the marriages were registered, and they were asked if you want to stay together. So there was actually a pretty high divorce rate around that time, because people would be like, I want to get out of this. Or there were one guy with multiple wives, and the wife had to divorce, basically he had to kind of divorce the rest of the wives. And so it's very interesting how this one law really changed the structure of families, but also kind of helped to elevate the status of the women. And also very interesting is a political representation at that time for women is really kind of, it's like a jump start. It's like a really jump very high. So the first Congress, this was back in 1954, women actually had nearly 12% of the seats. So just give you a comparison, I did look up how many women were in US Congress around that time. So the data I have is in 1959, there were 17 women out of 537 seats in US Congress that combines House and the Senate. So that's about 3%. So this, was almost like imposed in a way, but they were really kind of trying to lift women into the political decision-making process. But also women were really kind of fully participating in the labor force as well. And that's, famous scene from Mao is holding up half of the sky. It's very interesting because my grandma had been like a housewife for years and years, and she raised 5 kids and everything. Then suddenly after back in the like 1950, and she was offered a job. So she's like, I don't know what to do. Like, I've never had a job. It's like, oh, it's easy. Just like, it's like, we'll train you, you will have the job. So she got a job. And all the women I know growing up had job. I don't even think I had the concept about housewife. It's like there's no such thing as housewife. Women, men both have to work. So it was a very full participation of the workforce at that time. And one thing to keep in mind is, of course, just like the traditional role of women will not die immediately. So what happened is women generally carry the dual role of being, working and also taking care of the household at the same time. I remember when I was growing up, all my friends' parents both work, right? And then but generally the mom will be the one coming back from work, still had to cook, had to take care of the kids and everything. So I remember my mom was always very tired all the time because it's not easy. So just to give you some idea, when I was growing up in China in the late 70s, and that was pretty much the image I have as a young girl, right? You're young, you go to school, you have the chance for education. There was no such thing as women cannot get education, and you fully participate in all kind of activities. Eventually, you will acquire the skills, you will get a job, and kind of it's a very idealistic kind of picture for a young woman to have that at that time. So if you think the picture was too rosy, because it was, it looks like, wow, it's wonderful, right? Women had like this full participation, holding up half of the sky, and everything is perfect. But it's not necessarily so, because there were a lot of restrictions on individuals just in general that was also imposed on women as well. So the first thing is really about that time, there was no such thing as individualistic pursuit of anything, right? So there's no individuals. We were all told we have to be part of the connectives. So for example, this young soldier, he was like the role model for every kid at that time. And his whole thing was to serve the people. You don't have yourself. It's your entire existence is to serve the connective, serve the people. We don't even know who the people are, but it's definitely not yourself, right? So it's always serve the connective. And he's one of his famous motto is, it's great glory to become a nameless hero. So there's no encouragement of individualistic kind of pursuit of freedom. And there's not such thing. I remember when I was in school, every semester we have to write a self-evaluation for even when you are 7 or 8, you have to write. And then you get feedback from your teacher. My teacher always writes something like, don't try to stand out too much. It's like, you're not encouraged to be different. But so that's like the really the mentality of at that time is you are part of the connective. In his word is, we are a little screw in the entire machine of the socialist machine or something like that. But also there are a lot of structural limitation on people that really kind of not giving you that very ideal picture of you can be equal. So for example, most restriction on mobility comes from this structure called hukou system. So it's a household registration system. So here, I know like we are just used to the idea like, oh, if you want to move, you pack up and then move to another street, move to another part of the town, move to a different city, move to a different state. Nobody's going to tell you no, right? And in China, even like now, there's less restriction, but we still have the hukou system. Basically means you are tied to a specific address. Okay, you cannot just say, oh, geez, there's another house down the road. It's better. I'm going to move there. You can't. You have to go apply for it. If you want to move to a different city, if you want to move from rural area to the urban area, you can't because there are quotas of every place. So when I was growing up, my mom's hukou, the registration is in one town. My dad's registration is in a different town. And I had to follow my mom to go to school. And I cannot go to the school in my dad's town. My dad cannot just say, oh, my family in a different town, just going to find a job there, because there's no freedom to move for work as well, because you are also all work were all the jobs were provided by the state, right? So your job, you are assigned this job, you cannot just say I quit. There's no quit. You just kind of if you want to go kind of get another job, you have to wait for a slot to become available, and you apply, and it's very like I know so many couples been separate for years and years because they couldn't move to the same city. And then of course what you can consume, like it's not, I'm sure some of you know the ration system, like you literally there's a limited supply, and so everybody gets like 5 pounds of meat, or like I remember I get like 30 pounds of rice, and there's like some flour you can get. So everything was on ration, like a fabric, like I only get like new clothes every like twice or 3 times a year, because my mom had to use kind of use the ration for the fabric to think about, okay, clothes for everybody, and things like that. Cooking oil, I remember once, as a young kid, I was sent out on an errand, and I, to get the cooking oil, and I fell on the way back. I broke the glass, and all the oil went, and I, 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 I was so scared to go home. And then my dad had to come out to find me, and he's like, "What happened?" I said, "Oh, I lost all the cooking oil. We don't have cooking oil for the whole month." And luckily, we got some really nice neighbors and share some with us. But it was very, kind of again, you literally cannot survive because you don't get the basic supplies for your, survival. And then lastly, like the travel restriction, not only because we have very rudimentary travel system like train stations like that, but also you cannot just say, I'm getting on the train. You can't, because you have to get permission to travel. You have to get permission to get on the train. So basically somebody has to, most likely from your work unit say, well, your Liren Kaplan is a good comrade, and she's not going to make trouble, and and she's traveling to this to this destination for work purposes, something. So it has to be like somebody had to voucher for you. And it's the same for hotel. You cannot just go to a hotel. You have to prove you are in this place for proper reasons. So there's a lot of restriction on where you can go as well. So you can see if Samuel's work came in during this time, it's like no use. Like what, like this is like impossible dream for anybody to say, I'm just going to travel freely and enjoy different culture, different life, and things like that. It's not possible. So just quickly show you some, those are like coupons for rations. So they were like for wheat flour, for rice, for coal, like everything in life. And also, even if you have the coupons, and there's still limited supply. I remember my mom always had to, like, if there's something we really want and she knew it would be undersupplied, and she will go line up and then you're trying to get stuff just like that. So all this changed dramatically. I'm like actually very grateful I live in a different time than my parents, because I was still relatively young when the reform happened. This was late 70s and early 90s. So after the Cultural Revolution, and Deng Xiaoping took over, and he was a very pragmatic person. So for him, he's like, well, you know, we need to give people better life, because it's not going to sustain ourselves. So we have to do many reform measures to make sure we're catching up with the world. So he basically, he had this famous scene, says it doesn't matter if it's a black cat or white cat, as long as you catch a mouse, it's a good cat. So basically he said, I'm not concerned about socialist, communist, or capitalist, as long as we make like people's life better. So he's the one basically introduced market economy to China. It's like, well, this will work, right? So once that happens, he also basically kind of trying to say, hey, you know, we don't have to be all the same. We don't have to all work for this connective. We can encourage individuals to become better first, because, you know, we can get some people better, then eventually everybody will be better. So he had, you know, again, he's very pragmatic. You can tell by his quote. He's like, let some people get rich first. And also another thing he did was really opening up to the world, kind of make China like open, not just in terms of travel and tourism, but also in terms of market as well. And so that changed China dramatically. Like I said, I'm really grateful that I lived through this period of time, because I witnessed all the changes in the society. I remember, like, even when I was in high school, you could see like people start to dress up more. You know, you like, even like simple things like having more meats on your table. It's like you notice little things like that. And so just in terms of mobility of this population, it changed dramatically. So first of all, you know, it is really the economy, market economy's mandate. You know, if you have a market economy, you cannot restrict the labor force. You have to say, okay, we have those workers, and then this other city has more demand for this type of workers, and they should be able to kind of freely move over to a different place. So there's like that freedom of movement really become very, very necessary. And also, there are a lot of policy changes in the 80s and 90s, and really kind of make that population more mobile. One of them was they didn't get rid of hukou system. So the household registration system is still in place now, but they made it much easier for people to move. One measure they did is to introduce a national ID card system. I know it sounds like a really controlling, but trust me, when you can take your ID and get on the train, it's pretty convenient. So basically, they introduced the national ID system in '84. Then that's to facilitate the population to move. Sorry. And also there are a lot, because the market economy, there are a lot of private ownership of business, and that will make it more easy for people to move from job to job. When I graduated from college, the state actually provides jobs for all college graduates at that time. So like I was guaranteed a job in the state system. But after a year, I get really bored. I was like, I don't like this job. So I quit. I went to private sector. I got jobs there. So I had a lot of freedom to move. My parents never had that. My dad was in the army. Then he worked as an engineer. Then like in his 40s, and then suddenly like there was a shortage of judges, and they were like, oh, you're becoming a judge. He's like, what? But Yeah, he become judge because that was a requirement of, like they just say we need more judges right now. He went back to school, he become judge. But what I'm trying to say is he never had a say in the process. He just like, well, whatever you want me to do, right? It's a state demand of whatever service you provide. But for me, I had so much more freedom to choose where where I work, where I live, and everything. And also infrastructure change. I'm sure some of you travel to China at some point. If you can see the pictures back in the 70s and 80s compared to the pictures now, the streets look so different. The city, the landscape look different. Train stations, absolutely, totally different. And trains look very much modern. Of course, we have those high-speed trains right now. When I was in college, this was back in the 80s and early 90s, and go from Shanghai to Beijing on the train, it's an overnight 12-hour trip, right? Last time I was back in China, they have the high-speed train between those two cities. It was 4 hours. It was just incredible infrastructure, construction, and airports and everything. So the entire population is so much mobile. Just to illustrate this, I'll show you some numbers from the Spring Festival. So Spring Festival is Chinese New Year. That's like Thanksgiving here, so you have to kind of travel back home, get together with your family, have the meals and stuff. So it's really the rush time, high travel demand time for the country. So back in 1954, there were like 23 million trips. Okay, those are mostly people from like my dad in the military, and you will get like a time off to go back home to visit your family. So there were like most people who work in a different place and they had to go home for the festival. And in 84, you can see people start to move, right? And so this was 500 million trips for the country. And 94, that become 1 billion trips. And 2023, this was after COVID. So this was like a recovering time. So I don't know if the number really reflects how many people wanted to travel, but it was 1.5 billion trips. And so this is a comparison of how that compared to Thanksgiving travel in the United States. But of course, we have 3 times more of the population, but even take that into consideration, it's still a lot of movement. So again, the population is incredibly mobile and this moment. So the increased mobility also changed the concept of travel. So when I was little, honestly, I can tell you, I didn't even know there was a word called tourism or being a tourist, because you travel for business. You travel to go to school. There was no such thing as travel for pleasure and enjoyment. It's like, what? Like, first of all, you don't have money for that. And second, you're not allowed to just wander around the country. Actually, in the 60s and 70s, 50s, if you travel around without a purpose, you can be arrested. So it wasn't like so tourism is actually, for a lot of Chinese, it's a very, very new concept. And so first of all, there were like international tourists start to come to China starting in the late 80s and late 70s and early 80s. My first job actually was a tourist guide. It was very interesting. But that was like China kind of see that as a big, kind of economic boost for the country, but also a kind of for Chinese to see, oh, people just travel to see a different culture. They want to see other people, how they live. It's like, that can be the purpose of your travel. That's very interesting. So starting in the 80s and 90s, and people start to think about, oh, travel, oh, vacation, or travel to go see the world, kind of concepts start to set in. And then then the government see tourism as an economic booster at that time. So they started this thing called Golden Weeks. So there were 3 1-week, they say 1 week because they also kind of wrap in another weekend. So it's literally more like 10 days vacation time for Chinese. So it's one in May, one around Spring Festival, so it's generally it will be January or February, and then one is in May, one is National Day, which is October 1st. So it's 3 basically 10-day vacation time, and they were trying to encourage people to travel during this time and being tourists, and again, it's an economic booster kind of thing. So just very quickly, if I can, I don't know if I have the number. Oops, sorry. So the Golden Weeks started in 1999, and so that year there were 28 million travelers, and then in 2014 there were 475 million travelers. So you can see there's like the booming of tourism in China as well. Another indicator is really about passports. Again, when I was little, I didn't know there was such a thing called passport, because like not many people actually would go out of the country, and people had passport at that time. Normally they get what we call public passport. So basically means you are traveling out of the country for business, for like official business, right? So I had a neighbor who worked in a different, like I had become a one of those workers in Africa. So because he worked for a Chinese company who got a contract in Africa, so he had a passport. But again, most people had no idea what a passport is, And so you can see before the reform days, the total passport number issued for the entire country was 210,000. And then just in 1 year, in 1990, it was 1 million. And then in 2016 was 60 million. And now there are many, many Chinese people actually holding passport because they know now you can travel all over the world. When I first came to the United States, I learned that only about 30% of Americans have passports. I was like, are you guys crazy? Like in China, first of all, when I was getting my first passport, it was really, really difficult. It took me a lot of documentation, a lot of I have to show bank statement and everything to prove I can go somewhere else. And here you get passport, and also you guys don't even know you get visa-free visit to many countries. And for me to get a visa to come to the United States was, wow, that was a lot of work. So anyway, so you can see there's increased number of people start to be able to travel and see the outside world, and that really changed a lot of the mentality of the society as well. So let's go back to Samao. I know we went off a little bit, but there was a point. Basically, what I'm trying to say is Samao really came in when her work came in the 80s. It was a perfect time because there was a receiving population really wanted to see the outside world, and then they also realized it was possible for them to see it. So mainland China kind of trying to, the PRC, the People's Republic of China, eventually at one point had a negotiation with ROC in Taiwan, and finally they say, well, look, there were people who were separate from their families for decades, and let's kind of find some way for them to come back. So eventually, before that, Taiwanese can go to Hong Kong, and then they can go through Hong Kong to mainland China. But eventually they did start to have direct transportation between Taiwan and China. So residents in Taiwan were allowed to visit mainland China starting in 87. And so Samao actually jumped on that almost immediately. And she actually traveled back and forth many times, and she visited many places. She visited her ancestral home. She visited the graves of her great-parents and everything. But even before she went to China, starting in 83, and a lot of mainland Chinese magazines start to publish stories from her book and stuff. And then eventually they see her articles were so well received, and they start to publish books, and without her consent. They were mostly pirated books. So I realize now, most books I read of her books I read, they were pirated. They were she never got any royalty out of those books. And the interesting thing is, I saw an interview of her, and she actually talked about this. And she did come to China like a couple of trips, and she was trying to negotiate with publisher and just say, can I get some royalty out of all the, millions and millions of books you published out of, without my consent. And it was Chinese copy laws, copyright laws were never very, very good. Eventually, I don't think she got anywhere with the royalty, but she actually, in the interview, she said, I don't even care about the money. She said, I just love to be loved here. And she was so well received. Everywhere she went, she was a celebrity. She was surrounded by fans, and she walked on, in the street, and people stop her, take picture with her, and she just really enjoyed that connection she had with the readers in China. Again, most of her readers are young women, like at that time, teenagers all the way up to mid-30s and stuff. So that impact really lasts for decades. So I just want to say, first of all, I'm an example, right? I basically saw the possibility for me to be outside of a country I grew up with. And, I see the possibility of getting education. And somewhere else, I see the value of traveling to different cultures and, appreciate different people who are different. And there are other people as well. So this is Iris. She just happens to be my sister. And she's 3 years younger than me, and we grew up together. We used to read books together, so I knew we were both fans of Shan Mao. And so she's actually now, she's a social media travel writer, and she actually quit her job. She quit her job, and she just loves to travel. And because of the social media influencer income stuff, and she was able to sustain herself to travel. She's like, I work really hard to save up money so I can travel. Now I can travel and write, and then I get money, and then it's the same thing. And also she, starting about 15 years ago, she started to get invitations from countries like the United States, Australia, and Switzerland, where the tourism bureau trying to promote the country for Chinese travelers. So she would get free trips, and she's been to Australia for 4 times, all free. It's amazing, and they really kind of pamper them as well. So she's traveled to be to like more than 50 countries, and she travels nonstop. As we are speaking, actually, she's flying to another city, and she has about 2 million followers on social media, and that's how basically that's her job right now. So those are she's been to Spain, Thailand, Israel, Japan, like I said, Switzerland, United States several times, Canada, many, many places. I'm very jealous. But not only like well-educated like women like my sister had this luxury to travel, but also I think people who are like women who are used to have a much limited resources now see travel as an empowerment. And so the most recent internet sensation in China is this. I know she's 56, but in China a lot of people call her grandma. I know it sounds really terrible because I'm not a grandma yet. But anyway, so her name is Shu Ming, and she had a very interesting story. So she's a factory worker for many years, and she's married for the guy, and she had a daughter with him. But the husband has always been very abusive, and she was never happy. And she eventually realized she's suffering this really severe depression, and she felt like life was not worth living. And eventually she basically just packed up. She left her husband, and she got a little compact car. And so she started to just drive around, travel. And it's very, very interesting. And she's like, okay, I'm traveling. I want to document my travel. And so she's like, putting it on the Chinese version of TikTok. It's like the original TikTok. But anyway, and she got so many followers, and people just like all see her as being using travel as a way to empower herself. And so she just kind of randomly driving around, and she will like meet other people. She will say, okay, where do you think would be a good place to go in November? And they were like, oh, we're all going to this place. So she made a lot of friends on the way, and she really see travel as an empowerment, as a way for her to find herself and to find her, like for her whole life, she lived for other people. She lived for the husband, for the daughter, for the grandkid. And finally, she's like, this is a time for me to find myself. So this was a quick clip from her post, as she kind of basically did this little summary about 3 months. So this was at the 3 months mark where she left home. She left her husband, and she was driving on the road, and she was talking about it's going to be Chinese New Year. This is going to be the first Chinese New Year I spend on my own. But she's like, I'm free. I'm so happy. So
我从家里出逃已经3个多月了，一路南下，跑了7000多公里，一路上也看到了祖国美丽壮观的风景，也遇到了志同道合的驴友。谢谢。从哪开过来？从河南，因为他们害怕我的小车子不安全，所以每次都把我夹到中间。
And she said, I breathe the air of freedom, and I feel much better. So anyway, so I think it's fascinating. Women have heard to basically, this is available for me. This is a possibility for me to feel liberated. And I can see that, I can actually realize that. It's not just kind of imagining something, a place far away, but I can go there. I have it. And she was great. She had all those tips about how to set up like a tent and how to but anyway, so I'm going to conclude with a quote I found on the internet while I was like thinking about what I'm going to talk about for this topic. I was like searching for what people think about Sam Mao. So I found this quote in this Chinese, it's like a Chinese Reddit. So basically people have like a theme, there were people writing and stuff. So this woman, she's in her like, I would say late 30s. So she started to talk about when she was in high school, it was a senior year. If you don't know about Chinese high school, the senior year, you are preparing for this national college entrance exam. It's one exam, lasts for 3 days, and your entire life depends on that. So it's very, very stressful time for her. So she talked about how one day, she was all depressed and everything, and she discovered Sam Mao's book. And she said she took it back to her dorm, and all her dorm mates started to read Sam Mao's work, and they all feel like they just feel so much better because they see there's a possibility at the end. So this was what she wrote. She said, your writing expresses indescribable ache in my heart. In those oppressive days, my free heart longed to wander, but was imprisoned. It was filled with infinite yearning and imagination for the unknown world and for faraway places. It was you, Sam Mao, who helped me understand all that was not a luxury, not a fantasy, but achievable. So I think that's, for me, it's really the meaning of having Sam Mao in our lives is really for us to see it's possible. So that's pretty much it. Okay.
Influence for your sister reaching out?
I would say no. Say was I my sister's did I influence my sister to travel? Not really. She always wanted to travel, but she's younger, so yeah, that's right. But in general, she loves to travel, just like me. But she doesn't have kids, so she's more free than me.
Going back, your lecture was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
Going back in history when women were first getting employed, was the salary equal to men? And how about today, salaries with women and men?
Actually, it's very interesting. The salaries were, yes, the same. So basically, if you have the same job, the women and the men will have the same salary. The salary is set, but they were equally low. So basically, it's very, like I was talking to my friends, we were talking about my parents' generation, and it's always two working parents household. But at that time, if you have only one parent working, you won't have enough for the family. So basically, two parents had to work. So there wasn't like that. So structurally, women and men were definitely equal, or more equal at that time. But there were a lot of like other kind of discrimination. So for example, when I graduate, I was guaranteed a state job, right? But we still need to go interview and stuff. I remember I went to interview for the foreign ministry, and so they said to me, do you plan to get married soon? I said, well, not really. And they say, well, if you do you plan to have kids right away? I said, I don't know. And then they say, if you come to work for us, you have to sign a contract and say you cannot have kids for 5 years. And then, like when I graduate, the male students in my class tend to get job offers much faster than female students. But if you get the same job, it's the same salary. But just quickly, I actually do have a couple more slides. I was worried about time, but it does have some kind of more updated status. So let me see if I can go there. Okay, let me hide this here. Okay, so now again, the education opportunity has always been there. So girls were in, the same way. You go to school. There was a period after reform. Actually, the women, like a girls' opportunity for education actually went down, particularly in rural area, because a lot of rural area they want girls to participate in the workforce instead of getting education. So a lot of girls actually dropped out of school to go support work and support the family. So that actually kind of now it's bounced back a little bit. But when I remember in the 90s, we had an actually campaign to support girls to go back to school. So there was like the downside of capitalism is, yeah, sometimes when you give the freedom to choose, and women tend to carry the negative impact. But this is the latest stats I can find. It's about in college, just like the United States, how now you have more women in college than men. In China, it's the same thing. So you tend to have more like now women actually. There were more women in college than men. And then in the labor participation, and women is still lower than men. This is now, it's lower than men. It's ironic because I have quite a few college classmates. I graduated from pretty good college in China. So a diploma from my college guarantee you a pretty good job. But quite a few of my college classmates, females, a couple of my roommates actually decided not to work, become housewives, which is a very new phenomenon. So there are like educated women decided to withdraw from the workforce. That's like a little newer phenomenon because there are like maybe one partner can make enough money to afford one person to drop out. But women's participation rate is 61 and men is 75, so it is higher, and men now do make more. So just to answer your question, men do make more. And another, let me see if I do have the stats for United States. So labor participation rate in United States, this is back in 2019, is 57% for women and 69% for men. So just in general, Chinese labor participation rate is a little bit higher. Another thing is really about leadership roles in companies. So China, the higher level directorship level jobs, the percentage is quite low. In the United States, it's about 29%. It's the same in Europe. So we don't really have, just in terms of like the private sector where you have a higher position in business, women don't really get that many positions. But politically, it's slightly different. So, well, it's not so different. So this is the newest 7-member of the Politburo, and they were like all men, right? And there were so this 7-member body, which is the ultimate decision-making body in Chinese politics, never a woman in that group. Back in 97 and to 2022, there were one woman with this like expanded Politburo group. There were like 24 members, so there were one woman in that group for a few years. But it has been like the highest position in terms of national leadership. It's very, very low. But in terms of like a middle level, like a provincial level, or like a municipal level and other, there's always like a little quota system. They say we need to have at least one woman in a leadership role. So, but the problem is when you say you need to have at least one woman, what happens? They just have one woman, right? We're like, hey, we meet the quota and we're good. So it tend to have those token women in leadership roles in political system for years. It is harder for women to climb up, just in general, and just the go back to there like very quickly. I heard this one sentence. I think it was great. It said, "The women holding up half of the sky. It's more like a promise rather than a reality." Mm-hmm. So, and another thing is, I'm sure you heard about the incident with the Chinese tennis player, right? So she accused this very high level leader to basically sexually harass her and basically raped her, and had a forced sexual relationship with him for years. And then when that came out, it was the commitment of gender equality, and then this really strong desire to control everything, they don't really go well. So the Chinese government eventually basically, in my opinion, forced her to retract the whole story. And China did have a Me Too movement. Briefly, it didn't go very far in many ways. And then another issue, so with China, okay, nowadays, in my opinion, it's really hard for Chinese women, like in many, many different ways, because we have like different forces kind of coming toward you. Of course, you have the traditional cultural norms, which is actually coming back after all those years. So there are a lot of people actually trying to say, oh, women's place is, should be in the kitchen, in the household, or you should, kind of take care of the kids. So that one is actually reviving. And then, of course, we have the communist, like, the political system where they don't want too much independence and rebellions against the system. And then you have the capitalist force, which a lot of times will turn women into commodity. And, basically that's if you go to any auto show in China, that's what you see. You have young women, sitting there being gazed upon by a group of men. And then a lot of rural women particularly would have, they have the freedom to move out of the rural area to go work in the city, but what kind of jobs do they get? Because they're mostly never graduated from high school. So mostly they get manufacturer jobs. And so a lot of migrant, like a lot of female workers eventually basically work this low level, very minimum pay kind of factory jobs. And their working condition is bad. They work like more than 10-hour shifts. And their living condition is terrible because a lot of times they will live in the dorms, in the factory. And so there was, back in the 90s, there was a factory fire, which was very well known, where the at night, to the business owners trying to kind of have control of the workforce, so they locked all the doors of the building, and then they had a fire. Basically, about 87 women died in the fire because they couldn't get out. They were all actually, most of them died at the exit which was locked. So that was because of the really terrible working condition and also not really good pay. A lot of migrant workers, female workers, eventually fell into to become sex workers or become mistresses for some people in the city, because that's slightly easier job. And then, of course, now we have the issue with imbalance of male-female ratio. So the between the age of 24, I think. Hold on, let me look. Between the age of 20 to 29, the ratio of male to female is 110 to 100. So basically means there are 10 men will not be able to find a wife in the same age group. So because of the selective births, because of the one-child policy. And so there are a lot of issues to be faced with gender equality. And then it's more complicated now than ever. So I'm sorry, that's like a long-winded way to answer your question. Any other question?
I have a question if no one else does.
Go ahead.
Did San Mao know how beloved she was?
Yes.
She did?
Yes, she actually did a lot of interviews. I saw quite a few. Chongqing is actually in Sichuan province. It was. Now Chongqing is one of the direct municipality under the central government. Chongqing was part of Sichuan. So we speak very similar kind of dialect. And so she used to travel to Sichuan all the time. And she was recognized in the street in my hometown. And people like will surround her as she talk about how like she get a rickshaw. Those are more for tourists, but anyway, so like there will be a rickshaw driver, and they say, "Oh, aren't you San Mao?" And she has a very distinctive look. If you see, you saw her picture, and so she was very highly recognizable, and she was like a celebrity. And I think that's part of the reason why she went back. It's very interesting because I saw an interview with her parents after she passed away, and the parents talk about how every time she went back to China, mainland China, she went back home, she was always emotionally drained, and it was very hard on her just to be back. But she kept going back because she wanted to have that connection with readers there.
Well, we can't thank you enough for being here today and answering all our questions and telling us about a fascinating person.
Yeah, well, feel free, thank you. Feel free to stay. I can ask any questions you have. I can take that.